Hi there, and this video is going to be covering one last geochemical cycle, so the water cycle. Again, this one is probably the one that you're most familiar with before coming into this class, but we'll go over some of the ins and outs with it. So again, talking about water in general, water is needed by all living organisms. So again, it's something that we rely on a lot. It's the universal solvent, which means that it dilutes other materials. It causes them to be kind of weaker overall just because water has the ability to kind of incorporate it into itself. It's very important for biological processes. A lot of things when we talk about our bodies, especially, that are mostly composed of water, again, some of the things couldn't travel through your body the way that they do without water being present. It is a reactant to photosynthesis and a product of cellular respiration, as we discussed earlier when we were talking about the carbon cycles. Um, Also, while new water molecules are formed during the water cycle, most of the water reused in the cycle came from comet and meteorite impacts on Earth billions of years ago. So the whole idea is that, again, water is being recycled over and over and over again. So again, looking at it piece by piece, liquid water from bodies of water and the ground is heated by the sun and rises into the atmosphere as water vapor in a process known as evaporation. Again, that's our key term for this point. So again, liquid water turning into water vapor, a gaseous form, is evaporation. Water from plant leaves also enters the atmosphere. So again, this is more water vapor, and this process is known as transpiration. So basically, whenever plants have a little bit too much water inside of them, again, if you've had me for horticulture, I've talked about this function in leaves before. They basically have little tiny holes inside of the leaves that can release this water vapor. Again, this is what's being released into the atmosphere, and it contributes to some of the water that's going to be present there in the atmosphere. Water vapor forms water droplets on dust particles in a process known as condensation. So you've maybe heard this term before, condensation, when you talk about water droplets on the outside of like a water bottle, especially when it's hot in the summer and you see water forming on the outside of it. So similar concept here. Again, we're seeing the vapor, again, going from a gaseous form to more of a kind of liquid form here as it's combining with some solids, dust particles. That's a little bit of what's going on in condensation. It's still mostly kind of gaseous because, again, this is what's happening in the atmosphere. The water droplets form clouds, start to collide and stick together, and form larger droplets before falling down from the clouds in a process known as precipitation. So again, we're seeing these solid and liquid components kind of combining together, going from this gaseous state to eventually becoming dense enough to start returning back down to Earth in precipitation. And when we talk about precipitation, we normally think of rain, but also when we see things like snow falling or hail, any form of water that's falling from the sky would count for precipitation. That counts within that. This fallen water enters bodies of water and the ground again. So again, we think mostly of water in terms of bodies of water, but don't overlook the amount of water that's in the ground itself, too. There are large bodies of water kind of underneath the earth. Whenever you hear people use the term aquifer, again, that's something that refers to large stores of water that are under the earth, and it's a very important part of this cycle. So again, if we're looking at all the pieces together here, liquid water from bodies of water and the ground is heated by the sun and rises into the atmosphere as water vapor in a process known as evaporation. Water from plant leaves, transpiration, also enters the atmosphere. Water vapor forms water droplets on dust particles in a process known as condensation. The water droplets form clouds and start to collide and stick together to form larger droplets before falling from the clouds in a process known as precipitation. And this fallen water enters bodies of water on the ground again. So again, we see it as a full cycle. So again, here's a graphic if it is beneficial for you to see kind of the whole process together. Part of what we're seeing here in this graphic that we didn't discuss in great detail, there is obviously a lot of water that is stored in high altitudes where it's colder. When we start talking about the tops of mountains where we see that there's kind of that white peak, that is a store of water. So sometimes we're seeing melting areas from those mountaintops that contribute to the water that's in the environment. So that's what they mean here by snow melt runoff. So again, these are some of the components that can get cycled through. Again, they use the term groundwater here to refer to the water that's underneath the soil. So don't overlook the water that is in that part of the process. And again, if it is beneficial to kind of hear another video that covers this material besides me covering it, when I post this on Classroom, make sure that you watch the video here on the water cycle as well to kind of reinforce some of those ideas. So now looking a little bit here at the human impact, some of these might not seem as direct as the other ones for how our impact is on the water cycle. Because some of these it's very direct in terms of us using the water. Some of it is not as straightforward. Here in the upper right, we see a device. You've probably seen these if you've been driving by farmland areas and you see these large stretches of these weird kind of contraptions that mostly have wheels and a frame. This is a device used for watering crops. So again, this is where we reallocate a lot of water, is to supply our crops that maybe are growing in areas where the waterfall isn't as good. Whenever we talk about going through periods of drought, we try to make up for that so that we have all the groceries that we need in the grocery store on time by redistributing water to those areas. Here in the bottom right, even though this is a green energy source, this is another way that we kind of manipulate the water cycle. This is a hydroelectric power station or a dam. So again, we're using gravitational force to kind of back water up to one higher area, and then the force of gravity pulls that water down and can turn turbines to help generate electricity for us. So even though it is a more green source of energy, that is us manipulating water for that purpose. In a related vein, when we're looking here at just electricity in general, if we're not getting it through hydroelectric power, chances are a lot of times we're getting it through coal power. When you use coal power or even nuclear power, water is used in the process. It almost always involves heating a body of water to help create steam to move a turbine. So most electrical energy has water somewhere in that purpose, but that water may be used in a very different way. And again, that water that we reallocate for that purpose is taken out of the environment. Here we've got a well. So again, if we're talking about conventional ways that we gather water for drinking, that's another thing that's kind of straightforward. The factory plant back here, it may not seem very logical, but again, water is used a lot in terms of making products. So creating like plastic products, for example. Water is used in that process to help create those items inside of a factory. So we use a lot of water for that. It produces a lot of wastewater when the process is done. And then finally up here in the uppermost picture, we see a forest that's been cleared out. And again, the water that's in this picture isn't very obvious, but it's inside of the plants that are here. Again, we talked about transpiration, plants releasing water vapor through those little holes that are on the undersides of the leaves. So trees not being in parts of the environment that they were before makes less water vapor inside of that area in terms of the atmosphere there. So these are all different impacts that we have, mostly on relocating water for our own purposes. So again, think about, why would studying the water cycle be important for ecologists? Again, we already talked about all living things rely on water to survive. Obviously, water conservation is a big deal for us as we start talking about droughts and dry conditions that cause a lot of natural disasters that are related to that. Water is something that we need to be concerned about on that level, but we also need to think about it in terms of the environment and how the environment is supported by water as well. So think about, why is studying that cycle important for ecologists as well? So again, I hope that this was beneficial for helping you understand the water cycle in a little bit more depth.